Awesome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll wait for folks to hop in here. I see some of the attendees coming in. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our session this morning. We're going to give folks just a couple more minutes to get into the session this morning before we start. We're super excited about our first webinar with the Education Trust today. So we'll give folks a couple more minutes before we get started. Thank you for joining us today. I feel like we should have music playing. Welcome, everybody. We'll give folks just one more minute to hop into the room before we get started this morning. All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Stephanie Para. I'm the Executive Director of All In Education. Very excited to have you all with us this morning for Advocates in Action. We're going to be talking today about the impact of the American Rescue Plan and our ESSER funds on education equity. And super excited to have Tara Wallen from the Education Trust joining us this morning. Tara is the Associate Director for P-12 Accountability and Special Projects at the Education Trust. So Tara, thank you so much for being here. We're super excited to hear from you and have you all share with us what your recommendations are from the Education Trust. So I'm actually going to pause there and turn it over to Tara, who will have a presentation for us. So Tara, let me make you host real quick.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie and team. So excited to be here. I'm hoping everyone can see my slides. If you can't, please let me know. But I want to jump right in, want to get into the details and make sure we have time for Q&A. I'll be trying to look at the chat as I am talking, but that always gets a little bit dangerous. So feel free to add Q&A or something into the chat, and then we'll definitely circle back to it at the end if I can't address it directly. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Tara Wallen. I work for the Education Trust. Actually began my career as a high school special education teacher and have worked for the federal government in Denver public schools at the district level, and now I'm at the Education Trust. which if you're not familiar with us, we are a national nonprofit organization focused on closing opportunity gaps, particularly for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. And we do most of that work through research and advocacy. And so we do a lot of data analysis, publishing reports, highlighting inequities, and providing recommendations for solutions, but also a lot of direct work with advocates at the state and local level. So how did we get here, right? We're going to be talking about the American Rescue Plan, which is kind of the third big federal bill that passed. But just a reminder, you know, over the last year, the federal government provided funding through what was called the CARES Act back in March of 2020, which Arizona received about $277 million for K-12 education, and the vast majority of that was disseminated to school districts. And then in December of 2020, Congress passed another bill that sent about $1.14 billion to Arizona for K-12 education. I will say we're going to be sharing the copy of these slides after, so please feel free to take notes, but also you'll have a copy of this and be able to click into all of the links. I think just general framing here, in most places, districts and states have used their CARES money that came about a year ago. Many states use that for kind of initial safety precautions that had to be put into place, to provide digital devices, to do summer programming last summer. A lot of districts and states are still using the money that they received in December 2020. And then the American Rescue Plan came along. It was signed into law by the president in early March. And so the ARP includes another $123 billion for K-12 education. It includes some additional money that's set aside for non-public schools or private schools. So I will say that $123 billion, and I'm going to show you some Arizona specific numbers, are for public schools only. There are requirements that states meet called maintenance of effort, which is essentially that the state has to continue spending kind of the same share of its budget on education as it has in the past, and maintenance of equity, which is actually focused on if districts, states or districts have to make cuts to their spending for any reason, they need to shield the highest need schools, which are the highest poverty schools, from those cuts. These funds, districts and states will be able to use through September 2024. That's when they have to be obligated. So over the next 3 to 4 years. I did a little bit of digging on the Arizona Department of Education website, and I will say this is always tricky sitting in a national organization and starting to do your kind of investigation at the state level. Arizona has published a list of a lot of the state level efforts it's doing with the state money, but there's not much information about exactly how much money is going to each school district or exactly what the requirements are going to look like at this point, and that's not abnormal. I think that's where a lot of states are right now. So of this big pot of money, how does it have to be used? Well, states get to retain about 10% of the funding, but 90% of it has to go to eligible school districts. And the money flows based on the share of Title I funding that a state or a district receives. So if you're in a district that normally receives about 20% of Arizona's Title I money, you receive about 20% of the funding that Arizona gets through this. It does require both districts and the state to set aside some money for evidence-based strategies to address unfinished instruction. You might hear some other people refer to that as learning loss. We really don't want to frame it in that way to imply that there's blame on students or that they've lost something that they had before, right? We just know that there's an opportunity to finish some of the learning that hasn't happened yet. And then there's some additional set-asides for evidence-based summer programs and comprehensive after-school programs. So what are we talking about for Arizona specifically? Well, just a reminder, this is just K-12 education. So for K-12 education, through this American Rescue Plan, Arizona will receive about $2.5 billion. The vast majority of that, 90%, will go down to school districts. So that's the green on the top is what's going to districts, and the orange is what stays with the state. About $2.3 billion to districts, and then they have to use at least $465 million of that for addressing unfinished learning. They could spend more than that, but they have more flexibility with the other 80% of funds. And then you'll see similar, there are set aside the requirements for the state level funding. So I think big picture, if we look across the two bills I talked about at the beginning and then this one, over the last year, this is about an additional $4 billion of federal funding for K-12 education in Arizona. And that, presents an opportunity. I think, I'm sure there's some educators or local leaders on the phone or on the call. And really some of that is funding just needed to fulfill the service and the promises that schools have always wanted to provide and haven't been able to. And some of it is to address the unique circumstances that COVID has brought and that the economic impacts of that virus as well. So what are the key dates to keep in mind? The U.S. Department of Education has already given about 2/3 of the money to states. To receive the final third, states have to submit an application to the U.S. Department of Education by June 7th. And then once states have the money, they have to allocate it to districts within 60 days of receiving those funds. And there are two relevant district plan pieces to know about. So there's the state plan, and then the district plan, there's two different things that districts have to be thinking about. One is within 30 days of receiving the funds, they have to put out a return to in-person instruction plan. So if they are already in person, this is very simple. They may already have a plan like this that's publicly posted, so this might not require new work. But if there are districts that are primarily remote learning right now, they have to put out a plan that talks about how they're going to get to in-person safely. That doesn't mean they have to open within 30 days. It doesn't mean that the funds are conditional on reopening. It just means they have to publicly post some plan about how they're eventually going to get there, even if that means they're not going to be in person until the fall. And then within 90 days of receiving the funds, they have to release a more comprehensive plan about how they're going to use all of this funding, and that they actually have to submit to the state and then have the state approve the plan. So what would be in those plans? How can this funding be used? I think the one important thing I just want to say is that states and school districts are required to do meaningful stakeholder engagement. And I've listed the organizations that the U.S. Department of Education is requiring. So students, families, tribes, tribal leaders, civil rights organizations, superintendents and charter school leaders, teachers, principals, school staff, and stakeholders representing, for example, kids with disabilities, English learners, and other traditionally underserved student groups. So this should be, part of what I hope you get coming out of this is there's a real opportunity here, and this is starting to happen now. So if you're not hearing from your districts or the state about engaging in this process and providing input on how the funding can be used, I hope you're starting to reach out to them and say, we know that these plans are starting to happen and we want to be involved. But really the funding can be used very flexibly, which is why I think the stakeholder engagement piece is so important. It can be used to do things like address unfinished instruction and address social, emotional, academic, mental health, physical health needs. Can be used to prepare for reopening, so any kind of sanitation costs, additional COVID testing, facility repair and improvement, including things that would improve air quality, which is, we know, directly related to COVID, purchasing education technology, providing those mental health services and support, so hiring additional counselors. And there's kind of a big caveat, things allowed under current federal law. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so Title I or Title III, which supports English learners, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, the IDEA, anything allowed under those laws are already being funded. This funding can be used for those purposes too. So that would include paying staff, preventing layoffs, hiring additional staff to run some of these programs. And beyond all of this K-12 money and what I was talking about, I'm not going to read through this, but you'll get the list. The American Rescue Plan makes lots of other targeted investments. So Arizona will get about $17 million statewide to support students and children experiencing homelessness, both to identify those students, provide wraparound support. There will be additional money for students with disabilities through the IDEA. There's money for Native American students and tribal communities. more broadband access, which I think the Arizona Department of Ed has put out a little bit of information about, more AmeriCorps tutors, Head Start programs, childcare, and supplemental nutrition. So you'll get this in the slides afterwards to see some of these numbers. And then I've also included a link where Arizona put out some estimates about how much they're expecting to receive in each of those buckets. So I think that's important context, just to know that this is really multiple streams of funding, and there has to be a real coordination about how to use these pots together. So for example, there's going to be money provided through the E-rate program, which provides broadband access often to schools and libraries, and there's also some flexibility in homes. You know, we think about using that money first before using the K-12 money to do broadband access, right? Like, how are you using the narrow pots of money to fulfill a need, and then thinking broadly about these K-12 funds. So what should you, whether you're an educator, an advocate, a community member, what should you be asking your district about how they're going to use these funds? I think, you know, there's a note here at the bottom, but this is an opportunity to not only think about the impacts of COVID, but frankly, the inequities that existed before COVID. And we hope, and I know lots of advocates are thinking deeply about, how do we make this about coming to a newer, more equitable world, not just a return to a pre-COVID world where we know that there were lots of students who needed more support. And so big picture, we've been thinking about 5 big questions. You know, how is the district meaningfully engaging a diverse and representative set of stakeholders, both in developing the plans and then implementing those plans? So districts could provide money directly to schools to engage with their community, to provide training to their educators on how to do that. They could use money to form partnerships with community-based organizations that maybe reach into communities they've had trouble communicating with in the past. So immigrant serving organizations or community-based organizations that have particular language expertise the district may not. The second question here, what data is the district going to use to identify student needs and then monitor student progress? And I think sometimes people hear what data and they think about test data or just academic achievement data, but we really want to think comprehensively about opportunity to learn data. So do they have data on students who maybe haven't been engaged this year? Data on the amount of instruction students actually received, whether it was remote or in person, student access to extracurricular opportunities or whole child supports, right? Like, let's think comprehensively about data. Third, how will the district ensure funding is targeted to the students who need it the most? So the law requires the money to go to districts based on the percentage of Title I. There's no specific requirements for then how districts use that money within the district. So they could use it on district-wide activities, something that's available to all schools or a set of schools, or they could provide direct funding to schools. And so I think, for example, here, you know, equitable is not equal. So I think something we would be concerned about is saying that a district is just giving each school the same amount of money, or each pupil, each student the same amount of money, without thinking about individual student needs. And we know, for example, students with disabilities or English learners require additional services. And so we'd hope to see that there was a greater investment in services for those students. Fourth, how's the district targeting resources to create safe and equitable learning environments and provide whole child support? So this could be things like, you know, more mental health providers, more school counselors, thinking about where those folks are distributed or if they're shared between buildings, what kind of additional support is needed both now and over the next 3 years. It could also look like a really cohesive district plan to re-engage students who haven't been engaged. So perhaps that's something that the district was relying on individual schools or educators to do. The district could use money with a community-based organization or another expert to actually think about how do they use this summer to re-engage those students. And then fifth, you know, we continue to be concerned about the unfinished instruction or the interrupted learning that students had. And we know it's going to look vastly different from student to student and school to school. But how's the district going to implement evidence-based strategies to support those students? We have a series of briefs that are going to be linked into the resources about how to think about things like targeted intensive tutoring or expanding the school day. and grounding those in really strong relationships between adults and students. So I think those are a couple of the strategies you could think about implementing, which also looks like for students who are ready for further acceleration. How could you increase access to advanced coursework, dual credit, CTE, lots of different opportunities for students you're looking to re-engage. So I'm going to stop there. The slides that you'll get afterwards go into a bit more detail for each of these questions, for example, about what types of things you might be looking for from your district. And we'll also be releasing a document like this next week that we'll be sure to share out with all of you. But I'm going to stop there and get us to some Q&A, I think.
Yeah, awesome. And I will go back to sharing my screen so that we can kick off the Q&A here. Can you see my screen? Hold on. I'm like, where did my screen go? Hold on. Give me a second. It disappeared on me. Okay. Can you see my screen now? Okay. Awesome. Okay, so we have a few questions planned out here for our conversation. And then please, if you have questions, please put them into the chat and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Tara, the first question we have is, how can we be sure that these federal funds actually get to students and the schools that need them the most?
Yeah, I think this is a little bit thinking about those 5 questions, right? And I think the first thing here is, how do we figure out the students in schools that need them the most, right? We have some information in terms of student demographics. We know, for example, that we should be spending more for students from low-income backgrounds, students with disabilities, English learners, students experiencing homelessness that require additional support, right? And that's what equity is. But I think a big piece of this is about stakeholder engagement, both for students and families who were engaged over the last year and a half and those that weren't, right? How do we solicit information from those folks about what support they need? And we've seen people do this through surveys, making sure they're available in multiple languages and modes, and using community-based organizations to push those out. We've seen focus groups. Some districts are standing up kind of working groups or commissions that include community representatives. I think the important thing there is just making sure that those groups are truly representative of the school, the students in that school or district, and that those working groups or commissions kind of shouldn't be stood up just to do something till May, right? Like, what is the ongoing feedback loop going to look like? Because this is going to change over time. And then I think the point I was making just about if districts are going to distribute money within the district, the law provides flexibility in how to do that. And you can see a world in which that's done really inequitably. And goes to students with lower need or schools with lower need. And so really pushing in those conversations to ask district leaders, how are those decisions being made and how are we actually funneling more money to the schools that need it? Yeah.
And kind of just to piggyback on that, I know something I've been thinking a lot about. There's a lot of conversation happening about how this is, as a school board member myself, there's always like, this is one-time money, so we can't have like a long-term cost on our budget if this is one-time spending. What would you say to that? If you're putting yourself in someone like my shoes, right? If I'm going into these conversations with my own district, what would you say to folks who are saying, we have to think about these as one-time only investments?
So I think there's a couple things. I'm definitely hearing that in a lot of these conversations with state and local leaders and advocates as well. And I think there is a balance here, right? There is wanting to use the money quickly to address immediate student needs, things we know students need right now, versus holding on to resources and trying to do more long-term planning or concerns about spending money for a one-time thing we need right now, we won't be able to sustain. I think one of the things we come back to is what do kids need, right? Like what do students need versus thinking about adult worries are legitimate, but right, like how do we recenter the conversation in kids? And I think there's a couple of things here. One, this funding is for at least the next 3 to 4 years. There's a whole bunch of separate conversations. There was a big announcement from the White House today about trying to get more funding for early childhood and childcare, right? So it's hard to know, right? Like we're making the assumption there won't be any other resources around in 3 years. I think I will say from the advocate side, it's on us to think about how do we continue to fight for more resources in the out years after this big package. But also, frankly, I think it's more about thinking, how are you going to gather information over the next 3 years about what you need to make room to keep and what you can change, right? So you're going to try some strategies, maybe things like targeted intensive tutoring or hiring more school counselors. And if you're seeing returns on that, right, are there places you can make changes? Are there ways you can partner with philanthropy? Is there state and local funding reform that needs to happen over the next 3 years so you don't face a big cliff, particularly in your highest needs districts and schools? And I will drop an article in the chat. It may be behind a paywall, but I'm hoping people will be able to access it from Ed Week that one of my that is getting at this exact issue, right? Which is that the money won't be here forever. But what does it look like to have actual funding equity at the state and local level?
That's great. Thank you so much for that. All right. So in 2018, only 47% of Arizona's 83,000 English learners graduated high school in 4 years. So what should local leaders, advocates, and community members keep in mind about meeting the needs of English learners while they're developing their local plans to use this stimulus funding?
I mean, I think this may sound easy, but I think it's actually starting the conversation with those students, right? Keeping them centered, not as a tag along at the end of the plan, right? What we see happen in some places is districts or schools with all good intentions will say like, okay, we're gonna focus on a targeted tutoring program, or we're gonna expand the school day, or we're gonna provide some kind of additional learning opportunity. And they come up with what it's gonna look like, how they're gonna staff it, where it's gonna be located. And at the end of the discussion, right, there's like a list of student groups. There's English learners, students with disabilities, and it's kind of a checkbox exercise. Like, have we thought about each of these groups? Instead of starting the discussion and saying like, let's center our approach in English learners. So is the evidence-based strategy we're picking, does it have evidence specifically of working and supporting English learners? Not does it specifically support the general student population, how is it supporting English learners? I think if we're thinking through those questions and steps when we think about community and family engagement, how are you reaching out to communities where English may not be their first language or may not be the language spoken at home? When you're thinking about partnering with community organizations, which I think, that's one way you could use these funds for lots of different things. Are they organizations that are rooted within immigrant communities or that have particular expertise and experience with English learners? So thinking about who you're talking to, who your feedback cycle is with. I think the other thing I would keep in mind when you're talking particularly about things like high school graduation is that this funding can certainly be used to re-engage students who may be off track or further off track as a result of interrupted instruction. And so what does a comprehensive strategy to reach out to those students look like? And this is one where a district could, involve additional experts. They could fund an ad campaign that runs through the media channels that these students are most likely to be listening to, right? Like they could think about different modes and modalities that may not be as applicable to the entire student population, but are really important for English learners and their families.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. It is such a, when we think about our work at All In Ed, these are the stats that are top of mind for us, is how are we going to lift our communities up that need the most resources and support. So thank you for for sharing that. In Arizona, 46% of our PK-12 students are Latino, but only 16% of our teaching workforce is Latino. Do you have any ideas about how this new federal funding could be used to close the gap in diversity in our workforce?
Sure. And I think, first thing is it can be used for that purpose, right? And that's something folks should be thinking about. I think this is an example of one of those inequities that existed before COVID, right? This is not directly responding to COVID, but is responding to the opportunity gaps that existed. And so I think at the state level, I think there's a few ways to think about this. One, and this is not solely applicable to teacher diversity, but I think is important. There's not great data that exists, frankly, in most places about who are the people going through educator preparation programs. Are they diverse? If they are diverse when they start, who's actually completing the programs? Then what districts are they going to work in? And then at any individual district or school, what does the diversity of educators look like? And so states could use this money to build those kind of data systems, right? To build the infrastructure they need to actually have good data and to set goals. I think that's one important thing to think about. They could, some of these are kind of like not a thing you can buy off the shelf, but they require people and capacity that if you had someone for 2 or 3 years could actually make a lot of headway on. So working with preparation programs that have more rigorous approval standards, so they're actually focused on getting a more diverse teacher workforce, funding our guidance for districts and or those educator prep programs about how to work together, how to set goals, how to invest in local strategies to drive teacher diversity. And then I think at the district or school level, there are lots of places that have grow your own programs, for example, where they think about paraprofessionals or other school support staff. They could use these resources to expand those programs. I think it depends on the district, but we often see that those kind of grow your own programs have more diversity than some educator preparation programs, right? And so depending on where you are, that might be a really good pool of candidates to think about supporting. And so you could use this to pilot something new, expand something you already have, or to think really creatively. So Stephanie, maybe you should talk about this because I've heard you speak about it a little and I don't know it particularly well, but I know you all have done these parent education academies.
Yeah.
And I think that's an example of a strategy that could be funded here.
Yeah, absolutely. So Parent Educator Academy is a model that we started really in response to COVID. For those who don't know, if you're joining us today and you don't know about Parent Educator Academy, and I also put a link in the chat to our website regarding it. But it was really, during our community outreach last spring, what we heard from parents is that they were really overwhelmed with being asked to be educators at home, and it ranged on a scale of like everything from not knowing how to navigate to technology to parents who thought they were tech savvy until they're being asked to, get on Zoom calls and upload assignments and navigate all these tech tools that they hadn't done before. And so in response to what we heard from our community, we launched Parent Educator Academy in partnership with Chicanos por la Causa and the New Teacher Project as a way to meet the educational needs of our students in distance learning, but also to provide economic opportunity to families. We think that this could be a way to motivate and inspire some of our parents to pursue potentially careers in education as well, or become advocates like all of us in the education community. So we think it's a great program. It's actually proving to work. We actually have our parent in our first cohort. It's a small but mighty cohort. We're just under 30 this year, who is now employed by her school district. She's working in the school district, just got a job there. And so our theory is that exposing them to some of the content from TNTP can motivate and inspire potential future educators. So we're really excited about that. Awesome. So thank you, Tara. And I will go on to our next question. So we've already heard that some school districts and schools are nervous to spend this money. Oh, well, we talked about this one already. I kind of jumped the gun on that question. Any other comments on that?
No, I think the only thing I would add is that we've heard more and more from states or districts that either don't believe or have been misinformed that they can't use this money to cover costs they already have. So for example, they can't use it for teacher salaries for teachers that were on staff this year. And that's just not true. You can use the money, right? And actually the state application for these funds asks states to describe how they're using funding to prevent layoffs and to keep staff in school. So I think, given the $4 billion of federal resources, I hope that there aren't places in Arizona that feel like they have to make cuts. Appreciate that that's going to lead to some conversations over the next 3 years, right? About then how may we retain some of those staff. And I think I was talking to another state, they're hiring some state level folks to do capacity building who have particular expertise in working with districts on plans or who have particular expertise in early warning indicator systems that they think are going to be really important, or in re-engaging students or doing community outreach. And they've hired some of those folks into kind of contract limited positions, right? Like they've posted and they're hiring for a 3-year position. And if funding becomes available, they could keep those people, but they're essentially setting up the trajectory so that they understand they may not have funding to continue. And I think that's a little bit more challenging at an individual school or educator level, but it is an important thing to be thinking about, kind of grand scheme of things, that it doesn't mean you can't hire anyone. It just means you have to have a real plan to kind of beef up and then go back down in what that person is doing.
Sure. Thank you for that. Are there any questions from our participants today? I haven't seen any come through in the chat. If you have any final questions for Tara, please put them in the chat. And I will take a moment here to just highlight, at All in Education, we are incredibly committed to building a more equitable and just education system in Arizona. And we are asking for partners and colleagues to join us in that effort. And so if you go to allineducation.org/partners, take our pledge to be all in for equity, join our movement, join the cause. We, like Tara, like you said, we want to make sure that we're not going back to normal. One of the things I've been saying, and I know a lot of education leaders are saying this across the country, is that we can't allow ourselves to get complacent and go back to business as usual pre-pandemic. The pandemic was really an opportunity to expose all of the inequities in the system and the gaps in opportunity that we've been advocating to close for a really long time. And so, we don't want to go back to normal. We want to build a new normal. And so please join us in that effort and take our pledge to be all in for equity. I don't see any other questions. Tara, thank you so much for your time today. This was really, really helpful. And for the folks either in the room or watching us on YouTube, please stay in touch with us. Our website, allineducation.org. You can reach us at contact@allined.org, and on social media, we're AllInEdAZ. So thank you again, Tara, so much. Really appreciate you being with us today. And we do have, we want you all to save the date where we'll do another kind of webinar workshop like this. It'll be our third Advocates in Action event. Tara mentioned it briefly, strategies to solve unfinished learning. We'll have Allison Sokol from the Education Trust joining us on Tuesday, May 25th from 8 to 9. And we'll unpack what those strategies look like, what is most effective, and what we should be investing in to make sure that kids don't fall behind in this time. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.